Directors of CAM. I'm going to go over some housekeeping before we get started. First of all, we are recording this webinar. It will be posted to YouTube following the presentation for the enjoyment of the greater CAM community and the public. You'll be emailed a link to view the recording once it's ready for distribution. Today's Lunch and Learn is called Expanding Diverse Storytelling in Museums. The captioning today is provided by the National Captioning Institute. For captions in a separate window, the link will be posted in the chat. The public chat function will be closed for today, but our presenters welcome your questions using the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring the questions and posting them to the panelists at the end of the session. If you have technical issues during the session, please message us at CAM Programs using the chat box or send an email to programs@calmuseums.org, and we will do our best to address it. I'd like to go ahead and share one of the most important pieces of our program today, which is our land acknowledgement. Sorry about that, in the middle of my phone going off. These are all of our housekeeping moments here. Oh, do we have everybody on the call? And there's our land acknowledgement. All right. As we begin this event, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. A land acknowledgement is a critical step towards working with Native communities to secure meaningful partnerships and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. Our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. We honor and are grateful for the land we occupy and recognize the ongoing damage of settler colonialism. Let's take a moment together to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous peoples have shown worldwide. I am on the traditional territory of the Ohlone Coast-Alohan peoples. I encourage you to name and acknowledge the Native peoples where you are located in the chat box. There is a link, or there will be a link, if you don't know your native land acknowledgement or on whose land you are sitting. You can check that out at native.land.ca. Thanks, Rochelle, for that. Let's see. Shall we introduce our panelists now? Let's go back. This is a terrific webinar, and we're excited today to turn it over to David Burton, joined by Ilana Gustafsson, Corey Madden, and Delana Studi here to present the program today. Thanks again for joining us for the Lunch and Learn. Your support of CAM is very much appreciated.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Carla. I am David Burton. I'm the director of the Grace Hudson Museum, and that's in southern Mendocino County, where I'm zooming in from. And these are the ancestral homelands of the Pomo peoples. And we're very proud at the Grace Hudson Museum to have many exhibits, both historical and contemporary exhibits, that deal with Pomo arts and culture and that include Pomo artists, culture bearers, and educators. When we did this program in at the March conference in Oakland, 2023 March conference, we were actually at a bit of a disadvantage because one of our participants, Corey Madden, who you'll hear from a little later, couldn't participate due to a family emergency. So Ilana and Delana and I handled that program. I took a probably more expansive role than I originally was intended to take. I was going to be the moderator of the program. But what I'll do is I will say a little about my experience with diverse storytelling in museums and with a particular story. And then I'm going to ask Delana to weigh in, and then we'll go to Ilana, and then we'll go to Corey, and then we'll go to questions. Before I became director of the Grace Hudson Museum, I spent over 16 years at the Autry Museum of the American West. And when I started there in 1998, while the Autry's mission was to tell the diverse stories of all the peoples of the American West, they weren't doing a very good job of telling Native stories. And that's because they had a paucity of collections. And before they merged with the Southwest Museum of the American Indian in 2022-23, we were trying to figure out ways of telling Native stories in an institution that really, a collections-based institution that didn't really have much in the way of Native collections. So one of my proudest accomplishments at the Autry was to devise or participate in the start of what became known as Native Voices at the Autry, which is the nation's only equity theater company devoted to the development and production of plays by Native American writers, largely performed by Native American actors. And that was an important thing to try to get going, because without collections at the Autry, I thought one of the ways we could talk about Native history and the Native experience was through theater. And the original artistic and executive directors of Native Voices were Randy Reinholtz and Jean Bruce Scott. And they had done a lot of Native play development work in other parts of the country at various universities. And they had been invited to the Autry by our programs department to stage a contemporary Native play, which they did in the Autry's theater. It was remarkable. It was called Urban Tattoo by British Columbian First Nations playwright. And it was so remarkable that, with an interest in theater myself, I started talking to Randy and Jean about whether they would want to take up residency at the Autry for a few years. And they loved that idea. And so my job was really to go out and raise money to make it happen. And that included writing up like a white paper or a talking points paper that I could take all around to all the VPs and department heads, and then finally to the CEO, to see if there'd be an interest in doing this. And I got very good support from everybody. And finally, the CEO told me, well, if you can raise the money to get it off the ground, we'll do it. And so I went to our city's cultural affairs department and the LA County Arts Commission. And they loved the idea and encouraged me to submit grant proposals for each. And we got the initial funding to at least get a very modest play development program off the ground. The next year was able to secure a 2-year grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to continue supporting the program. And off we went. Again, with play development, with staged readings, table readings, things like that, before live audiences. And one of the things that I think is very important about, I like sharing this with people, is that we took a very measured approach to how we would grow the program. We definitely wanted to be able to do something different, new, and impactful, especially to the Native community, which is very large in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. But we wanted to make sure that we didn't bite off more than we could chew, that we didn't get too ambitious in the early stages. And so we started with play development workshops, with table reads, with staged readings. From there, we were able to secure additional grant funding, which allowed us to start doing workshop productions of plays on our stage. And then another year we got more grant funding, and we were able to launch a play festival, which would be, we were performing, I think we were selecting 3 artists per year to come to LA, work with dramaturgs and actors, LA-based actors, Native actors, with our core team, Randy Reinholtz and Jean Bruce Scott. And we workshop plays, and then we presented them in front of a live audience as a festival of plays. Anyway, the program over the years has grown in many different ways, including relationships with places like the La Jolla Playhouse, where for many years, we not only produced a play festival at the Autry, but then we took it on the road to La Jolla and had the advantage of working in a professional theater with, again, the professional artistic team at La Jolla. I look back now, here it is 2023, Native Voices has been going for 24 years now. And if I was proud to have been part of starting that program in 1999, 2000, I'm even prouder of the fact of what it's accomplished today. This in many ways is a tale about, creating the different kinds of storytelling in a museum, in this way, in a theatrical method. But it also allowed us to diversify the stories we tell from a cultural standpoint. This is a story about Native Voices at the Autry, but it's also a way to introduce Delana Studi. Delana was an actor in many of those early play development workshops and staged readings in the early 2000s. Has developed a wonderful acting and writing career as well. And a few years ago became the Native Voices at the Autry's artistic director when Randy Reinholz decided to retire. So with that, I'd like to start you off, Delana, by asking, you've seen the breadth of Native Voices. When the reins got turned over to you to be artistic director, what were you thinking? And did you have certain ideas of how you wanted to advance the program and move it forward? And just tell us about what it's like suddenly becoming artistic director of a program like that.
Well, no, thank you, David. Yes, I became artistic director of Native Voices 2 weeks before we shut down for COVID-19. So a lot of my learning was not on the job, but on Zoom. And so, of course, we had some amazing plans before COVID hit, but then, of course, like everyone else, we had to recalibrate how we were going to move forward. And so we were very lucky that during COVID-19, a lot of our tribes, including my the Cherokee Nation, was giving out technology stipends so that our communities, our reservations, our youth could have access to the internet. It was the first time my family got internet, was in 2020 because of COVID and Cherokee Nation giving out the stipend. And so because we were all learning Zoom at the same time, it kind of leveled the playing field. And I've said this many times, access is the most hoarded luxury, and it's something that Native communities don't have. And so because we were able to have access for the first time, and not just my community, but several other Native communities across America and Canada, by Indigenous playwrights, performed by Indigenous actors, directed by a course, that we realized we were able to invite theaters who have never done Native, showcase 9 Native playwrights, and 6 of them received full commissions from theaters who have never produced a Native play. And so that's when we realized that we had something very special on our hands. And so now, because of the access that was granted to us, every performance at Native Voices is recorded, and we can stream it for the communities that can't make it to the Autry in person. And so that's one thing that we've learned and we're able to do. The other thing is we've received our first Mellon grant. In fact, it's the first Mellon grant the Autry's ever received, to produce 4 new plays by Native playwrights for intergenerational artists. We were able to commission 2 Native playwrights so far. We have 2 more commissions to give away, which is very incredible. And then, of course, what I've been doing is we were trying to indigenize theater as we know it. And so we recently started a Native American dramaturgy course, so you can learn how to do dramaturgy for Native plays, and also learn to perform a dramaturgy.
Oh, we're really losing you.
that doesn't fit the westernized canon, which is very exciting. And this year, our Indigenous Director Mentorship Program, where we are in the process of creating that. I'm actually in the pilot program. I will be a co-director for our fall production, and that's to help me indigenize the way we do that. And they're losing me. So that's one thing that we're doing.
Delana, when you talk about your dramaturgy program, is this primarily to teach Native peoples the art of dramaturgy, or does that also include non-Native peoples who you're trying to teach how to better serve a Native play?
Absolutely. And also not just to better serve a Native play, but also to teach an appreciation for the different ways of storytelling. I think for so long, the American theater has been told a story a certain way, and we believe that's the epitome of all theater. And the truth is, there are so many beautiful ways to tell a story, and so many ways that story can be impactful, and so many audiences that need to see their stories reflected the way that they should be told. And so the dramaturgy program is open for everyone. And then, of course, like I don't know if you've heard that part about the indigenizing the directing program that we're doing. So that's going to be happening this fall.
Okay. Delana, tell us about your audiences for Native Voices workshops and readings and productions. I mean, Los Angeles has one of the biggest concentrations of pan-Native peoples in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. What's been the response of the Native community from an audience standpoint to what Native Voices is doing?
I'm so sorry, David, you cut out. What was that question again?
I'm curious about if you can comment on what the audience response to Native Voices at the Autry has been and is currently, given the fact that Los Angeles has a very large concentration of Native peoples there. And I know when I was there, a lot of those folks came out to see the shows. And I'm just wondering what you can say about how the audiences have responded and how they've been touched and by the work that the program is doing.
Oh, absolutely. The audience has been, we're very blessed with the audiences that we have at Native Voices and the Autry, because they are interested in hearing different ways of telling stories. At first, there was a little confusion and a little questioning, but now we are able to tell the stories authentically the way that they're meant to be told, or we don't have to provide a lot of explanation, which always detracts from a story. No one wants to go into a play and have 40 minutes of exposition, which was what we had to do before because Native history is not being taught. But now our audiences are on the same page as we are. So we're able to tell the story from start to finish the way it was supposed to be told. And so in a way, our audiences are growing with us, and we're trying to develop the next generation of theater goers at the same time. So it's very exciting where we are. And the great thing about being able to go virtual is now we're able to include more Native people in our audience as well. So the stories are being told to the people that need to hear them.
And what do you think the impact, or what can you tell us about the impact of Native Voices on the careers of many Native actors and other Native theater artists?
I honestly wouldn't be where I am in my career without Native Voices. I will admit to that. It was through Native Voices that I found my voice and then was able to find my words and create my own work. We have so many amazing people that have graced our stages. Some of our success stories is we have Gil Birmingham, we have Zom McClarlin, Kalani Cuepo, Tonat Carmelo. Most recently, we have Ramon Zaragoza, who is a series regular on the CBS show Ghosts, which is wonderful. And then for our playwrights, they've reached national acclaim. In fact, Larissa Fasthorse, I met her for the first time on the Autry stage. And she just had her Broadway debut, and she was the first known Native woman to have a Broadway debut. In fact, there's only been one other documented Native writer, and that was the person that wrote Oklahoma. So that was over a century ago that happened. So the fact that we have a century later, we finally have a Native woman on the Broadway stage is huge for us. And so and you'll find a lot of our Native playwrights are also writing for television now. In fact, Frank Hashkataz and Vera Starbird wrote for Alaska Daily. Princess Lukai Johnson created Molly of Denali. She was one of the creative consultants for that, and she just won a Peabody and an Emmy for that. So we have a lot of wonderful success stories that started at Native Voices.
Yeah. And how, Delana, how do you think the program Native Voices, with a great longevity now, 24 some odd years, what kind of impact do you think it's had on the Autry Museum itself?
Oh my goodness. The great thing about the Autry Museum is they're so open to telling the stories. I feel like now you can see contemporary Native art in the galleries. It's not just a place where you can view Native people as a thing of the past. They're incorporating Native voices into the galleries as well and helping us tell the stories. In fact, for the new exhibition, Imagine West, they used Aragon Starr, who is a Native Voices actor and playwright. Exciting. And in fact, one of our newest playwrights, in fact, the first person that received our first Mellon Commission, Dustin Timakara, we actually, he was brought to our attention because he was working on the exhibition. He wasn't really known as a playwright, he was known as a scholar. And so he came our way through Josh Garrett Davis. And so that's how we learned about Dustin. And so Dustin's now one of our playwrights to be on the lookout for. He's incredible.
Well, that's all wonderful. And I can speak to it myself. When I was still at the Autry, the impact the program had on really deepening understanding of Native cultures was evident when I was still there. And I'm glad to see it's become even more so. Well, at this point, I think what I'd like to do is bring Ilana Gustafson into the conversation. Ilana, at the time we did our panel in Oakland in March, was still at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles, and she's now gone to another venue in Pasadena. And I hope you'll tell us a little about that, Ilana. But some of the things we talked about at the March conference with you were some programs that you had helped create for Natural History Museum. And it included a social justice program. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how that developed, how it performed, and what its impact was for the Natural History Museum.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I am now at Caltech as a public event specialist, but I spent 13 years at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles, and was senior manager of our performing arts program, which it's the inception of the performing arts program was a program that's still running now, wonderful program called Dinosaur Encounters that featured features full suit dinosaur puppets. And so that was primarily what our focus was for many, many years. And several years ago, we wanted to find a way to highlight some of the cultural stories at the museum. And, similar to Native Voices, being able to sort of speak to what the exhibits maybe don't, or the exhibits maybe can only go so far. How do we then meet a cultural exhibit with contemporary human experiences? So that's what we started thinking about. And so we partnered with USC across the street from the Natural History Museum, the Institute for Theater and Social Justice. We worked with them to think about ways we could take our LA history exhibition and meet it with contemporary human experiences. So we worked with that institute, and then we partnered with some local nonprofits. So CHIRLA, which is the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, IDEPSCA, and LA Poverty Department, which works with people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles, creating theater for that community, or with that community. So we worked with them on what's called a Theater of the Oppressed or Forum Theater project, which is a longstanding form of theater that was started in Brazil. And what it's meant to do is to ask the participants, and these are non-actors, these are most of them non-actors, and it's to ask them, give them basically the stage. We wanted to give them the stage to tell their story, their human story of, being an immigrant, experiencing homelessness, any of these experiences we wanted them to share. So we spent 3 months training them on theater skills enough to be able to get up on stage and tell their stories. And what happens then is, to summarize kind of form theater, what happens is their stories are told and they don't have a good outcome. And the audience is then asked to step in the role of the protagonist and try to resolve the issue, which can't be done. That's part of the point, is that we wanted the audience to step in the shoes of this community and try to resolve something that is a longstanding struggle. And it leads to a conversation. It leads to, a conversation about the differences between one person's experience in Los Angeles versus another. And so it's really taking the LA history exhibit, meeting today, and then trying to find ways to have a conversation about the fact that what happened in the past is still ongoing.
Can you give us any examples about some of the short plays that you remember the best, or that you felt were the most profound?
Yeah, there was one story, well, so many, it's hard to say. One story that I thought was interesting was the experience of being a domestic worker. And in this story, the woman decided to share, she is basically asked to work endless days and hours and really not allowed to have time off, and wages are being cut. And she really doesn't feel like she has room to say, no, I can't do that, because she'd be replaced. And it's made evident that she would be replaced. And so then, an audience member came in and tried to step in her shoes, and she spoke up to the person that had hired this domestic worker, kind of told her off. And the audience was like, that's not going to fly. Maybe you feel comfortable doing that, but think of the position that person is in, that domestic worker is in. If they stand up to this person, they're just going to get let go, and there's her income. So that's one example that stood out, that it seems like, you hear these stories and I would do this, I would do that. And it's not so simple. There's so many factors to take into consideration.
And Ilana, were these performances, were they done in English, Spanish, both?
Both, yeah. So we had a live translation. So we a lot of the performances were in Spanish, and then we had live English translation, or vice versa. Yeah, and I'll just say, one thing that I just want to mention for those of you in the audience, obviously you're museum workers, and one thing to consider in working with community-based organizations is really making it feasible. So offering pay. Also, we offer childcare for our rehearsals, and food for all of our rehearsals, and all of that. So I just want to mention that, we asked a lot of these folks to tell their stories and be vulnerable on stage. And we tried to support them as much as possible and make it as feasible for them to do so. Yeah.
What was the preparation time like for the writing of these things, for the rehearsals and all that? So from the time that you decided to launch this program to the time you did your first performance, how much time were the the participants involved in? Just could you flesh us out a little bit more about the logistics?
Sure, yeah. I believe, from the inception to the production was about 6 months. But we took about a couple months to figure out which community-based organizations we were going to work with. So that took some time to just, and it was organizations that the Institute for Theater and Social Change had already had some relationship with. So we weren't starting from scratch. There was already trust built there. But we reached out to them to just figure out the logistics. So that took, a couple months. And then we started the rehearsal process about 3 months out from production. And it really started with some improvisational games to, one, help them find stories, like bring the stories up to the surface. And then two, to help teach some theater skills, some basic theater skills. So it was a combo of that, and that lasted several months. And the final pieces of the production really came together maybe about maybe 4 weeks out. And we had, we tried to keep it very low tech because we really just wanted to focus on the stories. So the piece itself, or the performance itself, took place in an exhibition hall with a stage and lighting that was brought in, and some slide projections as well. But other than that, it was really just these folks with their voices and their movements, try to keep it very low key. So so 6 months total, but about 3 months working with.
And how many people on staff of Natural History Museum were involved in this program?
Well, it was really me heavily involved. Very, at a museum, you wear a lot of hats. But then, of course, there was support from, we have a community engagement council, we have our marketing department, so we had support in that way. But as far as, this project wasn't necessarily built into our season, right? So it we had to get a little scrappy with it, but we did get support from the Department of Cultural Affairs in Los Angeles. So we did get a little bit of money from them as well to support it financially. But yeah.
And Alana, I want to ask you one more question, and then I'd like to bring Corey Madden into the conversation. Natural History Museum, pretty large institution. What can you say about, have you given much thought to how this program that you've just described could be scalable for smaller museums who have fewer staff and fewer resources?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you pare it down, it's really about giving space for people to tell their stories, right? So you don't need microphones, you don't need a stage, you don't need lighting, you need a space, this could be outside, it could be inside. And then you need, to build trust and build a support system for folks to tell their stories. But it doesn't have to be, it can be one person, it can be an entire organization. You can scale it in so many ways. But I would say that the core of it is really kind of bringing the exhibit to life. And in fact, when we first thought about doing this, we thought we would do it inside the LA History exhibition and take up some spaces within the exhibition. And I've seen that done in other institutions really nicely, where there's one person speaking to a small crowd. So yeah, and I just want to say also, we did make this program free because it was really important to us that people who maybe normally don't come to the Natural History Museum came, we didn't want that to be a deterrent. Yeah.
It also sounds like whatever your community you're in, find the appropriate partners to work with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alana.
Thank you.
Now it's my great pleasure to welcome Corey Madden into the conversation. Corey is a remarkable has had a remarkable career in theater arts, and she now, for the past few years, has been the executive director of the Monterey Art Museum. And I can say I had the enormous pleasure of working with Corey at the Autry to create theater in some of the Autry galleries. This wasn't a part of the Native Voices program, but it was something completely different. And Delana was a part of that as well. So, part of Corey's past was being Associate Artistic Director of Center Theater Group at the Mark Taper Forum. And anyway, she's had a remarkable career. And Corey, welcome. Sorry you weren't able to join us in Oakland for the conference.
Thank you. Everything's fine in my family now, so thank you for your concern. I do want to say that I'm on the Ohlone Costanoan ancestral lands and very grateful to be here in Monterey. I also want to just start with a little tiny story, which is part of my weird, I could consider myself a bit of a renegade museum director. I spent most of my career in theater, but I grew up at the Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian because my mother was the head of education. And so I was lucky enough to be really to see museums from within education lens. And so those kind of fundamental questions that get asked about how do you share what a museum's purpose is with the public kind of were fed to me very early on. And a lot of the conversations I used to have with my mom, because I would volunteer in the museum and I spent a lot of time at all the museums on the mall, were, once I was starting to do theater, were what's the narrative of this exhibit? It was a question that I remember asking her at a very early age. And I remember, because I spent so much time in the museums, I said to her at one point, I think that when you come into this exhibition, there's a prologue and it's missing, you're missing a prologue. And what we know now about, so I've gone on to do a great many projects in museums. I have worked with a large number of museums on designing everything from individual experiences, like a short story being performed in galleries, to doing full-scale productions in museums. And now I run a museum and we think a lot about narrative in a lot of different ways. So I want to just say that I'm going to talk quickly and broadly about that range, and maybe a little bit more theoretically or structurally, so that I think maybe that'll be helpful to people who have to design these things. But I do think that what Delana, David, and Alana have said up till now is a lot of what you might see happening as a result of asking some questions about how you want to involve diverse storytelling in your museum. And I think you can come at it kind of from two different perspectives. They have to join at some point. One of them is through the question of the lens of the audience, like, who do we want to come to the museum, or what is the exhibition about, and who do we want to connect with, and what are our barriers? Or the other would be, how do we want to design this exhibit to tell a certain kind of story, and what kind of role does narrative play in the design of the exhibition, and where could we integrate unusual forms of design? And we're used to designing, video in exhibitions. We're used to designing imagery in exhibitions, but I'm not always sure that everybody is thinking about the idea of experience design, which is narrative and shape. So the idea that physically moving through an exhibition, you might experience a prologue, a first act, a second act, a crisis. These are all elements of storytelling that could be really valuable. And I was lucky enough, I didn't do this project, but I was lucky enough to work with the Autry on a project called Contested Territory that was about the Civil War in the West, where I was invited to be right in the middle of the design of the exhibition. And we were really talking about the exhibition integrating performance into it, so that there would be, in a sense, kind of live storytellers sharing the exhibition in much the way that Alana talks about, that they would have learned a kind of enactment, I guess would be the best way to say it, and that they could enact the story as you walked through the exhibition. So they would be your tour guide. And I think that that's one of the most interesting possibilities about how to think about combining audiences' needs, education needs, and gallery design, is to begin to think about the role that live interlocutors, hosts could play. And of course, you see this in a lot of other kinds of theater experiences and other kinds of experiences that we go on when you walk through historic spaces and you have a tour guide who's in costume and things like that. We're sort of used to it, but it can be elevated in a pretty interesting way. So that's really that, I think, maybe my main thing to talk about, which is that who you invite to do that, it is very an important thing to be considering. I think on one hand, it's important to consider that all from the museum point of view, that museum folks themselves have some blinders, and that it's valuable maybe to bring some other people in to the conversation about how to make work that is highly scientific or that is highly technical more accessible to the public, and to be open to this and to really think of the education staff particularly, but also in your community, the people who are storytellers. So could be theater people, but it also could be storytellers of other kinds. Could be radio people, it could be film people, it could just be Indigenous storytellers. The way that they could be brought in early in the design of the exhibition for conversations about how do we connect this story more meaningfully to the public, and to be specific about what publics you're trying to connect with. And then I think from the point of view of people who are, from an audience point of view, I think that it's always really, really important. We do this a lot in the museum I'm in, a very, very small museum, is just not to expect that anyone coming into our museum has any experience at all, and that what we don't want them to do is just get all the received messages about art, because the received messages, particularly about art, are that it's only for certain people. It's elitist. It's that you're looking at a masterpiece that only people who are wildly, more talented than you are could experience and enjoy it. So we kind of do micro storytelling, and I would say that we integrate it with a lot of experiences of creativity. We bring a lot of the artists that we're working with into the institution. We break down their creative process, both by talking about their creative process, having them demonstrate some of their creative process, and having our educators actually do programming around their creative process, so that we really unpack that. And we did a lot of that during the pandemic. We did a lot of digital versions of these kinds of things, and those were really effective. So we use creativity and process. We also use this idea of narrative. So we do things like have a tour given by somebody who is not an artist, a curator, or an educator, but an ordinary person, and actually help them learn to think about their own curiosity as a way to demystify that coming into a museum is really, you have permission to come into a museum and experience it any way you want to. The Getty did a great job of this for many years. They invited all kinds of artists in Los Angeles to come and give tours on shows that were not shows that they were artists of. So you could come and have Kathy Opie, who's a wonderful photographer, take you through the Getty's photography collection. And I mean, it blew your mind to have her do that. So I think if you're thinking about what does it mean, just as Alana has talked about, what does it mean to have perhaps, a story which does not include a population come in and have someone from that population actually deconstruct it or criticize it, be able to say, I'm not seeing myself in this story. So this story actually leaves a lot of questions for me, because that is mostly the experience that we see, is that most museums are not really speaking broadly and diversely to multiple communities. We're speaking within a very academic and very scientific or very, art history sort of lens, unless you've really decolonized your own organization. So we're all working on that. And then finally, I think the other way that we do it is just through community experiences. I again think these are a little bit more relaxed versions of storytelling, but bringing a community into your museum for an event that is not necessarily seeing the show, but engaging them in what their meaning is, what their group is about, and then relating it to, or having them and asking them some questions about how could this or might this relate to what you're doing. It's a little bit more like traditional education experiences, but I think when you bring a more theatrical perspective about it, or you bring a storytelling perspective about it, and you really focus on not learning about art, but about what is bridging the gap between where I'm standing here today and that work of art, and where my curiosity comes up, or where I might be interested in this work. I think you then find that there are stories within that. And if you use experienced people, you can begin to unpack that, and that becomes a place of connection, literally a place of connection. So that's, to me, what storytelling ultimately is about trying to find connection between what the museum's purpose is in displaying work and the visitor. So I hope that's helpful. And I can talk a little bit about any project that you want to. I mean, I've done a bunch of them in a bunch of different settings. I helped develop the Getty Classical Theater program, did many projects in the Getty itself, starting with short stories. And again, like David said, built them up over the years. And eventually the Getty invested huge amount of money in their classical theater program. I helped we ran a cabaret at the Center Theater Group for many years, and we adapted short stories and did little music events. And we were often asked by museums to create an event like that for their exhibition. So one of the most successful was with the Degenerate Art exhibit. We did all kinds of cabaret from the 1930s in Germany. And so we did cabaret songs from the 1930s. And that was very popular. And we did it in the museum, and we did it also at the theater. It just created these incredible connections between organizations. That's also another thing to say, which is that it's a great marketing tool. If you can work with a regional theater in your community and get them making something in relationship to you, I think that then you are starting to actually bring audiences back and forth. So there's a million different ways to go at this. And again, I'm happy to answer anybody's questions.
Corey, I'm curious, you talked about having non-traditional people lead a tour of an exhibit and maybe describe it in a way that's personal, or that is certainly not as academic as one might find in a museum. Has that had any impact at the Monterey Art Museum and how you guys write exhibit labels?
Yes, I mean, we've become bilingual. All of our labels now are bilingual. And one of the things that we really are thinking about is about we say we want people to see themselves in the museum. So we don't use a lot of technical language anymore in our exhibition labels. And as we train people for tours, both our docents and also our educators, we're really thinking about, I would say, more of a question-based version of taking people through our exhibitions. We do have a lot of data that we can give people when they're interested, but we, as I think many museums do, we do more of this deep looking and then questions, and we really let people start to ask those questions themselves. So once they start asking questions, we do a lot of stuff with kids. Again, I don't think this is new news, but we like kids to tell us about art. So most of our tours are oriented toward having children tell us what they see. And I think that that's how I operate in the galleries myself. I go into the galleries. I've done a lot of writing work with people. I do exhibition tours where we do kind of deep looking, and I ask people to almost write poetry in relationship to the work, because I think that it's much more fun for people to just go deep into their own creative process. So I feel that's one of the places where I would say creativity is the key there in helping people use creativity to get at why something is meaningful to them, or to get at how I felt left out of this story. I mean, I think looking, for instance, at historical painting, I feel left out of a lot of historical painting. It's all by men, you know what I mean? Like, I remember going into a museum as a young person and seeing a painting by a woman and feeling like I didn't know women painted as a young person. So I think that when we can pay more attention to the critique side of also, there's no reason to make somebody have to think everything they see in a museum is good. It's important for them to be able to say, I don't I don't like this, or I don't believe in this, and this is, and to affirm that in a tour. Also bringing tours way down in size. You know, if you can develop more volunteerism and do more 1 and 2 and 3 people on a tour, I think you can get at things that are very different. And again, use volunteers, use other different kinds of people in your community, have a training so that they've been trained, but focusing on listening to their stories, listening to their reactions. I think you build a huge amount more trust in the institution and more connection.
Carla, I see you are back, and why don't you unmute yourself? Do we have some questions from the audience? You'd like to...
We have a question or two, but I'd love to open up both. I can monitor both the chat and the Q&A if anybody has something specific or compelling. As I do that, I'd love to posit something for each of our panelists. These are terrific presentations, and what a great way to spend our lunchtime in learning about your fantastic careers and imaginations and all the ways they have touched so many audiences and your colleagues. One of my questions for you as we let people get their lunch brains going for Q&A is to say, what's next? Do you each have a passion project, a pet project, something in the queue that you are just excited about? And you can turn it around. Who would like to go first?
I'll take that first, Carla. One of the things I was very, very proud of here at the Grace Hudson Museum, Grace Hudson was, for those of you who don't know, late 19th, early 20th century painter who made her reputation on painting portraits of Pomo peoples and of Pomo life. We have a large collection of Pomo basketry, which we love showing off, but this museum in its 6-year history had never turned the interpretation of that art over to Native peoples. And we created an exhibition last fall called Gathering Time, which was a show about Pomo art during the pandemic. We hired a Pomo educator, and she was also a tribal environmentalist to be our guest curator. We empowered her with selecting all the artists in the show, selecting every piece of art, writing labels, which we mostly just copy edited for smooth voice and all of that stuff. But we basically turned our temporary exhibition space over to Native peoples. And they created a beautiful show, which was very profound in the way that the pandemic, which as tragic as it was, and Native communities really suffered during the pandemic with sickness and loss of life and separation in communities that are used to gathering together on a regular basis. But what we learned about how the pandemic, actually, there was a silver lining. It made a lot of Native artists get reconnected to their traditional arts. And not only were they painting, but they were making baskets and making regalia. But that show and the success of that show, we had tremendous Pomo engagement in the show. And some of the largest audiences we've ever had at the Grace Hudson Museum. And we knew that we need to keep this going. We didn't want this to be a one-off exhibition. And the next show will probably be in a couple of years. I'm not entirely sure what it'll be, but I'd really like to play with the idea of having Native artists reflect on Grace Hudson and what she means from a Native perspective, because the way the museum tells Grace's story now, it's all about from the perspective of an Anglo community and Anglo historians. So that's an exciting thing that I look forward to.
Yeah, no, that is really elegant, and I'll look forward to that too. Corey, you are off mic. How about, what do you have pending?
Well, we're starting a project called Illuminato this winter, which is going to replace our miniatures. We've had for many years a kind of an art program where people contribute miniature works, and it's been around for 30 years, and we think it's time to reimagine it. Illuminato is going to invite the whole community to create. We have a creative director actually from Southern California involved, Abira Ali, but we are going to commission 4 art trees to be created and create a kind of forest inside the museum. And then we have the opportunity for people to contribute within that experience in all kinds of different ways. So they'll basically cover these trees with art. It's not a Christmas tree, but it's it's the time of where people are thinking about that. And then we are going to be doing all kinds of community-based performance and or parties and or gatherings in that space for 3 weeks. So we really have decided that we want to turn the museum inside out. And I think that that's something that we're thinking about more and more, that we want people to feel their creativity is really reflected in the museum, but we also want to try to build the right kind of experience to be able to do that. So we're excited about Illuminato.
Well, that sounds fabulous. Let's see, Ilana. And I have to say, Ilana, one of the best things I've ever seen in person was the dinosaur show. And I went first to be amazed, and then second to watch everybody else. And just that had to be so satisfying for everyone involved to just see awe on everybody's face.
Yes, that was one of my favorite things, is just sit on the side of the audience and watch the kids go, and adults. Yeah, and I'll say, I'm obviously not at the Natural History Museum now, and I'm at Caltech, which is a science and engineering institute, and working on trying to make science accessible. But I want to plug the museum and that show in particular, Dinosaur Encounters. It's had many iterations over the years, and after we came back from the pandemic, we learned a lot about. We had time to think about what is the purpose of Dinosaur Encounters, and really going back to what's not in the exhibition, what's not in the dinosaur exhibition, and that is seeing quote unquote living, breathing dinosaurs. So our shows prior to the pandemic were verbal based, and after the pandemic we made them nonverbal, and we really wanted the dinosaurs to just speak for themselves, and for the audience to just experience awe and understand that that's our role as storytellers there. It's not to give all the facts. We have exhibitions, we have wonderful educators, all kinds of facts can be found throughout the museum. How do we just get people to say, wow, imagine these dinosaurs? And then they go to the hall and they start learning more. So hopefully the storytelling, the seeing the dinosaurs really sparks that inspiration to learn more. So go see it, everyone.
Fantastic. And it doesn't look like we've had any action in the chat or the Q&A. I believe David did address the one question in progress that's in the Q&A. So I think Delana, you get the last word on what comes next, and what are you excited and hopeful about?
Oh my goodness, so many things. So we're gonna have our fall production pretty soon. And it's called Where the Sun Meets the Stars. It's by Alaskan playwright Frank Kashkataz. One of the things I'm very excited about, my heart project, that we're hoping to get back up and going, was something that I started with Native Voices a long time ago. It's a program I fell in love with. It's the Young Native Playwrights program. And so we're hoping to bring that back, and it will encourage Native youth to come to the museum, visit the galleries, and then create short plays about what they see and experience in the galleries. And so that's a program that's been near and dear to my heart ever since I did that, oh gosh, about 10 years ago as a mentor. And it's something I want to bring back, because also I feel for American theater, we need to start encouraging the next generation of audience members as well. And so that's something that I want to do. And so that's hopefully going to happen in January, fingers are crossed.
That's great.
Well, this is fantastic. There was just a lovely shout out in the chat. Thank you so much for doing this panel again. It was so jam-packed at the CAM conference. So you know, so many of us were interested, and that's just a great endorsement. And speaking of the CAM conference, save the date. The location has been chosen for March, I believe 10th through 14th in 2024. That's hard to say out loud, in Long Beach. So a lot of reveal conference theme and other exciting things are pending in the next week or so. So keep an eye on, oh, thank you, March 10th through 13th, Long Beach. So that's just great. I want to thank everyone for spending their lunch with us, and to thank Cam and Rochelle Hoffman, and as well as all of our panelists for going ahead and making this terrific opportunity happen for everybody. Our upcoming programs, you can see here, there's still time to register for the July 20th, the August 3rd, and the August 17th. A really, really good lineup of exciting things that help us grow as a community of practitioners and a community of learners. And I just want to thank everyone for their contributions to this program and to our museum industry in California.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. It was great to be with you.
Indeed.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Nice job, Rochelle.